Okay. There. Click. Yay. Okay. So I'm thinking if you have a question to kind of hang on to it until we get to the end and then come back and make a note of it. So I'm talking about, I changed the subtitle after the poster came out because this is a fine anthropological tradition. I've never seen anybody give a paper that had the same title that was announced. So I had to change it, otherwise it would have been bad, right? So it's now structured with meaning and their consequences. But I am still very much going to talk about mock forms. And I'm talking about mock forms as part of a response to this very large question, which is, how is it that white racism persists? Which is a huge question that begs us to respond to it. And what I want to talk about today, then, is Jane Hill's specific response as a linguistic anthropologist to this question, which is not that this is the absolute answer to that question, because that's not what scholarly work does. Instead, this is where you come at this question if you're coming from the perspective of a late 20th, early 21st century linguistic anthropologist in the United States. And she has expressed this position that I'm going to talk about part of. So I'm certainly not going to talk about the whole book, but I'm going to talk about part of the argument she's making in the book, The Everyday Language of White Racism, which came out in 2008. It's kind of interesting. I had been talking with Neil about doing this talk ever since there was a discussion about a post on Facebook, in Anthropology Club's Facebook site. And I immediately said, oh, I can do a talk on that. And that was back in fall quarter. So a couple of weeks ago, when there was a big fuss over some Fox News folks talking about a University of Arizona class where one of the textbooks is Jane Hill's Everyday Language of White Racism, I thought, oh, that's interesting. It looks now as if I'm following or leaping onto the bandwagon, but I was already there. This is actually a book which builds on an article which came out of a conference paper. And the article coming out of the conference paper is one that all of my intro to linguistic anthropology students read every year when I teach the class. It's a response, and today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the context of the question as it is understood by linguistic anthropologists and anthropologists more generally. I'm going to talk about the mechanisms that Hill describes, and I'm going to focus especially on mock forms, and I'm going to use Hill's discussion about how we can analyze these mock forms to look at that post that was the beginning of all of this, that's on the poster advertising the session. And then I'm going to think about potential responses, what we can do. And I thought about, when I put on the slide it says what we can do, on my very, very last slide for today. And I looked at that and I was pleased with myself because I didn't write, what can we do? You know, what can we do has this sort of hopelessness about it. You know, oh, what can we do? But no, this is what we can do, which is to say that linguistic anthropologists, not just Hill, but also Michael Lagar, offer us some useful and interesting tools that we can take in hand to address the situation that I am about to describe to you. So as I'm describing it to you, I want you to think about the fact that towards the end here, I am going to be talking about something that you can do about it. And this is important, right? Because race is a huge issue in the United States. Race is of enormous importance, and the problems surrounding white racism are very much front and center in our national conversation because they are so huge, because they are so enormous, and because they do have an impact on all of us. As a white person, I can opt out of that impact to a certain extent. And that's part of the privilege that I enjoy. That's the structure of racism in which we find ourselves. and against which I would like to be working. But really, if we're conscious participants in our national conversation, we have to be talking about race and racism in this country right now. We cannot, in good faith, opt out as members of our community. So what is race? Race is a social and political reality as it is understood by anthropologists. And as a social and political reality, it is not a biological fact. From a scholarly perspective, there is no such thing as biological divisions among human beings which could be labeled race. When you look at us at our genetics, when you look at us at the level of phenotype and genotype, what you find is that there are no clear-cut distinctions and that no biologist would ever, or physical anthropologist would ever, divide us up into easily identifiable and segmentable races. But it's a reality. The fact that there's no biological factness to it does not make race any less real. And I think we run into difficulty when we, as anthropologists, say, well, there is no biological race. It's people say, oh, well, then there ought not to be any problem, right? But it is the case that it's a reality, and as a reality, it has a measurable impact on the lives of real human beings in the real world. And I'm not going to talk about that measurable impact a lot. There is considerable work on statistics that represent for us very clear pictures of very real impacts of race. And that is a topic that would take us more time than I have. Doesn't allow me to talk about the language of white racism that I'm here to talk about. So I'm just going to mention that we've got relative distinctions in wealth, in education, in employment, in health, in incarceration, and in other areas of life, many other areas of life, in which the social and political reality of race cannot be denied, in which there is clear statistical data to support the existence of inequity on the basis of the social and political reality. Now, race and racism is part of what I'm talking about. When I talk about everyday language of white racism, I'm saying racism, and racism is this really horrific word that sometimes we shy away from. Part of what Hill does in her analysis of how we do this thing, everyday white racism, is to talk about the way that we respond to the concept and our internal ideas about our, in this case, meaning white folk, internalized ideas about what racism is. So, racism, as I'm talking about it, involves stereotypes and stigmatization. Certainly, it involves the the pathologizing of actual or imagined difference. So sometimes we're talking about differences that exist. Differences, for example, in linguistic production. Today, again, I'm not going to be talking a lot about things like the well-recognized status of African American vernacular English as a dialect of American English with its own grammar and its own phonological rules. Because we all know this as linguists. William Labov made this quite clear to us. And while the general public may not recognize the linguistic nature of this dialect, any linguist understands that African American vernacular, or Ebonics, if you will use the popular term, is a dialect. And probably comes out of Creole and has all sorts of roots in various linguistic parents. But the pathologizing of that form and the pathologizing of imagined differences is part of what I am talking about when I'm talking about racism. And I'm talking about racism, and Hill is talking about racism at a structural level, where structural racism is a pattern of negative treatment based on race, and which is this social and political reality, not biological fact, which permeates social institutions, and which creates those impacts that I was talking about earlier. That the source of differences in wealth and education and health and employment and incarceration is, we argue, with considerable support for the argument, structures, institutional level structures which create these impacts. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about racism. And I'm talking about a racism which can be, the impact of which, the impact of the structural racism can be seen in some very interesting places, including the implicit association test, which is a fascinating space for looking at, yes please, for looking at how these structures impact us. And if you haven't been to this site already, some of you have because I talk about it, and then everybody goes there, right? You should go to Project Implicit. They now have an enormous number of ways of testing your implicit attitudes about race, about gender, about sexual orientation, about ableism, so all sorts of things that you can test. And what you're testing, what you find out about when you engage in one of the many tests, including the test on race, that Project Implicit, this is a Harvard University project that's been going on for some time now, and there's a lot of publication coming out of it, again, indicating the very real impact of these structures on our implicit understandings. What these tests measure are levels that we can't consciously control. So what you do, and if you go in and you take these tests, what happens is that they'll have you sit someplace where you're quiet and you won't be interrupted, and they'll throw up these images and they'll tell you what to do with the images, and you have to click one or another button on the keyboard, so just one or two. So it's really game sort of thing. And if you go too slowly, it stops. You have to go as fast as you possibly can. And it has you connect things, not by telling you they're connected, but just saying, okay, if you see this or this, then hit the left one, and if you see this or this, hit the right one. And it'll start out if you see good and good or white and bad or black, for example. And then it'll say, okay, good or black is the left and bad or white is the right. And what it measures is the tenths of a second of difference, the teeny tiny differences in the amount of time it takes you to hit the button. To see what associations are more automatic for you and what associations are harder for you to achieve. And it's fascinating because you have absolutely no way to control it. You cannot make a conscious choice. You are entirely at the mercy of whatever the structural framework in which you are operating has put into your head. And it doesn't matter how you feel or what your intention is. It only matters what's the structure of meaning that's coming out of the community of practice in which you find yourself. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about racism, and it's predicated on persistent, pervasive, measurable negative consequences to socially defined populations and members of those populations, which is a vitally important part of the definition of racism I am using, and one which is quite different from the folk definition of racism that I am about to talk about. The anthropological definition of racism requires not just that there be difference, or perception of difference, or even mean-spirited assertions of the badness of other people. That's not enough. For it to be racism, it has got to have pervasive, persistent, negative consequences to populations of people. Which means, of course, that according to this definition, it is absolutely impossible and actually kind of ludicrous to claim reverse racism. Because no amount of thinking mean thoughts about me and other white folks is going to mean that I have a harder time getting a job. Absolutely no amount of mean-spirited talk about my personal habits and my language is going to have an impact on whether or not I can get to rent an apartment, or whether I'll be offered the best rate for my mortgage. And therefore, it is racism, not according to the definition that I'm talking about. And what Hill is talking about when she's talking about everyday forms of white racism is this kind of racism, is a kind of racism which is intimately connected to real negative consequences for populations of people and members of those populations. So keeping that in mind, we can talk then about the forms of linguistic racism that Hill identifies, because she identifies a number of forms of linguistic racism. And I'm going to talk just mostly about one of the forms that she identifies, but I encourage you to take a look at the book and to read other work that's been done after this on what she's talking about. So among other things, she talks about slurs, racial slurs. She talks about gaffes, things where, oops, I didn't mean to say that. Linguistic appropriation, the embedding of racism in American English are all elements of the linguistic racism she talks about. And then she talks about covert forms. So these are more overt forms. These are clearly recognized forms of linguistic racism that Hill talks about in the book. But she also talks about covert forms, and it's the covert forms, and particularly the mock forms, that I'm talking about today, because they fly so nicely under the radar screen. There are aspects of slurs, gaffes, and appropriation and embedding that we recognize and have to deal with and we make excuses for in other ways. But the covert forms operate because we can completely fail to recognize how racist they are. Because these forms of linguistic racism permit us to think of ourselves as not doing anything, and I mean ourselves, white middle class people mostly, as not doing anything at all that is racist. I didn't use the N-word. I didn't ask some professor, Asian American professor, how he managed to learn English so well. Didn't do any of these sort of clearly obvious things, but I can in fact engage in things that seemed perfectly innocent to me. And one of the things that I really love about the fact that Jane Hill writes about this is that she points out, both in the article that she wrote that became this book and in the book itself, that some of the covert forms, which are jokes in many cases, are things she used to do, jokes she used to tell, until she analyzed them and thought, oh, that's a problem. And now she doesn't do it anymore. You know, she has some of the items that she talks about in her personal collection of things, her coffee mugs with sayings on them. And now she recognizes that these are linguistic ways of contributing to structural racism. But before she did the analysis of these things, she did not recognize it because it's covert, and it's covert in a way that make it possible for people like me and like Jane Hill, us older white ladies, to not notice what we just did. Now, she has found, talking to people of color, that it is not invisible in any way. And this is, again, part of the structural racism, is that I can blithely travel through my life not noticing it exists. And no person of color can do that. That's why it is so important to absolutely quash the ridiculous notion that there is anything that you could call reverse racism. That's just nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Okay. Today I'm going to focus on mocking and mock forms themselves. Again, they're not the only forms of linguistic racism. They are, however, kind of interesting forms. And all of these forms of linguistic racism rest within a particular ideological structure. So I need to give you a little bit of background on how linguistic anthropologists more generally, think about our encounter with reality. And I need to do that by using some terminology. So ideologies or frames or folk theories are all different terms that we use when we're talking about common sense understandings that are shared by members of a community of practice. Community of practice is a very Linganth term because we're not talking about a culture or even speakers of a language. You know, if I'm speakers of French, well, do I mean Acadian French? Do I mean Languedoc? You know, which one? So we say community of practice, which is a group of people who basically do things together in ways that require that they share a certain amount of ideas of meaning. You have to be on the same sheet of music somehow in order to function as a member of a community of practice. And that sheet of music is the ideology or the frame or the folk theory. That's common sense. You just go, oh yeah, well, duh. And one of the things we enjoy doing as linguistic anthropologists is looking at people's behaviors and what they say and seeing, can we draw out some kind of image of what that underlying structure of meaning is. Michael Agar, whose work I'm going to talk about at the end here, talks about it as if it was an iceberg, where you have something that happens that you notice, like an utterance or a misunderstanding at the very tip of the iceberg, and you know as an anthropologist that underneath that thing, that utterance that's above the water, the stuff that's under the water that's holding that thing up is huge. And that's what you're trying to get at, is to understand what's going on there under the water. For linguists, obviously, we could be talking about surface and deep structure just as easily and say, yeah, there's something down there underneath, some system of meaning within which these various small things have to make sense. And especially when I'm looking at things that are funny, there has to be some really relatively simple and yet quite unique to the community of practice structure of meaning that's shared for things to be funny. If you've ever watched a film from some place other than where you are from, even in your own language, but sometimes in another language, and it's supposed to be a comedy, and sometimes you get the joke, and sometimes you sit there going, because there's something in that structure of meaning that isn't there, something that you take for granted. It has to be like, oh, well, duh, because it's not hard work, right? It's not hard work to get a joke. If it's hard work to get a joke, it's not funny. For a joke to work, it has to be easy. It has to go, phew. So what we're talking about are the structures of meaning within which that ease happens. And these folk theories are interesting because they're completely taken for granted, so we don't question them, we don't think critically about them. But very interestingly, the big, important folk theories that organize our lives, the sets of common sense understandings about the nature of the universe that organize what we do and how we perceive what other people do, those structures are things in which we invest ourselves in some powerful ways. So even though we don't think about them and we don't talk about them and we're like, well, duh, about them, we are deeply invested in them, both intellectually and emotionally. So if you challenge them, we don't say, oh, that's interesting, I was wrong. We leap to our feet and we say, no, you're wrong. I'm right. Why? Well, duh. It's just that's the way it is. So looking at what these things are, which all of us do, right? And I just went, that's what you do when you, I'm going to put up all those premises at once and just live with it. Sorry about that. So we have these folk theories, and all people have folk theories. It's not like, oh, bad people, you have folk theories. All communities of practice operate according to theories about the nature of the universe, which are different from one another, but none of them are particularly perfect in how they operate, and they're all constructed by the people who are in the community. No set of folk understandings came down from some Illuminati who worked out the perfect one and went vroom and gave it to us all virally into our brains, right? We make them up as we go along, and they look like things we make up as we go along. And we also often have conflicting folk theories, and at the end of the talk I'm going to talk about the fact that Americans have conflicting folk theories about the nature of the universe, and we can use some of that conflict to our advantage. But let's talk about this folk theory, the American folk theory of race and racism. And we're going to have to live with the fact that I'm going to have all the premises up at once, and you'll just pretend that you're only seeing one at a time. So the first one up there is that, and this is a premise that is fundamental to the larger community of practice about what race is and what racism is. The well done, the common sense. And we get to this not because people say this, or because it's written down, or because you learn it in school. We get to this because what people say and what people do. If you say, okay, underneath what those people just said and did, there has got to be a logic. Human beings basically make sense. That's, by the way, one way of talking about cultural relativism in anthropology. That's the term we use for that, which is not all human beings do everything and they are all wonderful, sometimes people think cultural relativism means moral relativism, which means I have to applaud everything everybody does, and that's goofy. But it is the case that I have to take as a given that no matter how strange what that person just said is, or what that person just did is, unless they are somebody that their community is putting into the Harborview Hospital for observation because they are clearly insane, right? Assuming that they have a community of practice who says, oh yeah, you make sense. There is some structure of meaning underlying what they just said or did. I can figure out what it is. I can use what they said and did, taking as a given there's some meaning underneath it, and I can try and describe that structure of meaning. So this is Jane Hill working to describe the structure of meaning, which, if it is what is the well-da stuff inside of our heads, and it doesn't have to be something we agree with, right? This is the other thing. I can say, part of the premise is that race is a basic category of human biological variation. As an anthropologist, I know that's not true. Nevertheless, I can understand people communicating with me within a structure of meaning in which you have to take that as a given for anything to make sense. This gets very interesting. If somebody says, for example, we need to do more medical research on populations other than white. Implicit in that is that there are biologically distinct races, which I know isn't true. And yet, plenty of people in my side of the political spectrum will argue we need to do this sort of medical research on other racial populations, as if there were marked, demarcated populations. We know that biologically there's more difference, genetically there's more difference within any group that's labeled socially and politically as a race than there is between members of different socially and politically real races. We know this from research. So, but we take as a given, as part of our folk theory, that race is a biological category. This predicates also that the end of racism is ahead of us when we just melt everybody together. So that wonderful Time magazine cover that showed they had taken all kinds of different faces and morphed them together into one different face that had all of the characteristics, and that's how we'll end racism, we'll just melt all the races. That assumes there is such a thing as races, and it's biological. The second premise in the American folk theory of race is that racism is entirely a matter of individual beliefs, intentions, and actions. So this sees education as a cure, and it sees racists as people you can easily identify. They're a small group of people, they are a bunch of hicks, they're kind of ignorant and uneducated, and all we've got to do is figure out how you can get those people into kind of being educated and smarter, and then we will have ended racism. Finally, part of this American folk theory of race and racism that Hill has identified is that prejudice is natural to the human condition. That everybody is basically drawn to their kind of people and against other kinds of people. That's just human. You have to overcome it somehow. And that has, one of the negative consequences of that is that it is the argument that makes possible the claim that there is this thing reversed.